Everyone laughed when a poor divorced woman bought a ruined and forgotten store on the edge of town. No one believed she could change anything, but one day her young son found something beneath the old floorboards that would change their lives and the fate of the entire town forever. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The rain hadn't stopped for 2 days. It fell in a steady rhythm over the cracked windshield of the old sedan as Sarah Miller tightened her hands on the steering wheel and squinted through the blur of water and light. The highway stretched ahead like a dull gray ribbon through miles of empty fields, the sky a low ceiling of clouds pressing down on the world. Her 10-year-old son, Jake, was asleep in the passenger seat, his head resting against a backpack filled with clothes and notebooks from a life they had already left behind. A folded eviction notice sat between the seats, its corners stained by coffee. Sarah didn't look at it anymore. She had already memorized every word. She had sold almost everything she owned during the last month. The furniture, the television, even her wedding ring, though it hadn't been a symbol of love for years. What remained was the last of her savings and a strange kind of numb courage that comes when a person has no more choices left. When she saw the newspaper ad for an auction of abandoned properties in a town called Elmridge, she hadn't hesitated. The listing had been brief. Old country store, disused, structure unstable, sold as is. Most people would have taken one look at the photo of the sagging roof and driven the other way. But Sarah had stared at it for a long time and whispered, almost without realizing it, "Maybe that's the one." The wipers groaned across the glass as she turned off the highway onto a narrow county road. Elmridge appeared slowly, a scattering of houses, some boarded up, others leaning tiredly against time. The once white church stood with its steeple bent, the gas station sign missing half its letters. A single dog trotted down the street, thin and soaked. Sarah's heart sank a little at the sight. It looked like the end of the world, or maybe the place where the world had already ended and no one had bothered to clean up. She parked in front of the property that the auction papers described as Crossroads General Store. The building sat at the intersection of two forgotten roads, its wooden frame leaning like a drunk old man. The sign above the door was so faded that the words were barely legible beneath layers of moss and peeling paint. The windows were broken, the steps half rotted, and an ancient bell hung above the door, rusted into silence. Jake woke up and stared at it, rubbing his eyes. "This is it?" he asked quietly. Sarah nodded, though she wasn't sure whether she was agreeing with him or trying to convince herself. She climbed out of the car, the mud swallowing her shoes with a wet sigh. The air smelled of wet earth and mold. She stepped up onto the creaking porch, pressed her palm against the doorframe, and felt the soft give of the wood. Inside it was dark except for the gray light seeping through the shattered glass. The air was thick with dust and the ghost of what once had been. Shelves along the walls, a counter with a rusted cash register, bits of paper and packaging scattered like memories. It wasn't just a ruin, it was a memory of commerce and laughter, frozen and forgotten. Sarah could almost hear the echo of footsteps, the ringing of that long, silent bell, a woman's voice greeting customers, a child's laughter somewhere behind the counter. She blinked and the vision disappeared, leaving only emptiness. She exhaled slowly and whispered to herself, "We can fix it." For the next few hours, she walked through every room, trying to see the bones of the place beneath the decay. There was a narrow staircase leading to an upper floor, probably once used for storage or living space. The floorboards were warped, but some of them still held firm. The roof, though sagging, hadn't completely collapsed. She took out the folded auction paper and read again the line that mattered most to her. Sold free of liens and property taxes. It was hers now. By late afternoon, the rain had stopped, leaving a still, damp silence. Sarah and Jake sat on the porch steps, eating sandwiches from a paper bag. A truck passed by without slowing down, the driver staring openly before disappearing around the corner. Jake leaned against her arm. "Are we going to live here?" he asked. "For a while," she said softly, "just until we fix it up." He was quiet for a long moment, then said, "It smells weird." Sarah smiled faintly. "That's just the past," she said. "We'll air it out." When the sun finally broke through the clouds, a thin golden light spread across the broken glass and dusty counters, making them shine for a brief, deceptive moment. Sarah stood, brushed crumbs from her lap, and looked around. The place was awful, but it was hers. That thought gave her a fragile sense of power she hadn't felt in years. As night approached, the temperature dropped quickly. There was no electricity, no running water, and the floor upstairs didn't look safe enough to sleep on. They ended up sitting in the car again, wrapped in jackets, watching the building through the windshield. The headlights made it glow faintly, like a ghost trying to remember it was once alive. Jake fell asleep first, his face peaceful in the dim light. Sarah stayed awake, her mind turning over the same doubts. What if this had been a mistake? What if she couldn't fix it? But even as fear crept in, another feeling rose quietly beneath it: determination. She thought of all the places she had lived since the divorce, all the jobs she had lost, all the looks of pity she had learned to ignore. This broken store, this miserable little town, might be her last chance. There was nothing glamorous about it, but there was something real in the way it demanded effort. She whispered into the dark car, "This time, I won't give up." Morning came gray and cold. The windshield was fogged with their breath, and Sarah woke with a stiff neck. Outside, the air smelled cleaner, sharper. She climbed out, stretched her arms, and looked up at the store again. It seemed slightly different in daylight, still broken, still weary, but less hopeless. Jake came out behind her yawning, and together they stood at the edge of the porch. A single ray of sunlight caught the old sign, and for a second she could almost make out the faded letters. Crossroads. The word felt important. It meant a meeting place, a point where two paths converge before diverging again. She wondered if that was what her life had become, a crossing between what had been and what could still be. The next hours passed in quiet labor. She found an old broom in the back room and began sweeping layers of dust and broken glass into piles. Jake picked up scraps of paper, bits of wood, and old bottles. They didn't talk much. The work itself seemed to speak for them. Every stroke of the broom revealed a little more of the wooden floor beneath, a floor that might once have shone. By noon, the inside looked marginally less like a ruin. Sarah sat on the counter drinking water from a plastic bottle and tried to imagine what this place could become. A bakery, maybe, or a small grocery store. Something simple, something human. She pictured shelves lined with homemade bread, the smell of coffee, the sound of a doorbell ringing again. For a moment, she let herself believe it was possible. But when she stepped outside to catch her breath, the weight of the silence around her reminded her how alone she really was. The houses down the street looked empty, and the few faces she saw peering from windows didn't wave. The world had given up on Elmridge long ago. It was easier to let things rot than to try to save them. Sarah understood that feeling too well. Still, as evening approached, she went to the trunk of the car and pulled out a blanket, a lantern, and 2 sandwiches for dinner. They sat on the porch again, watching the sky turn the color of rust. Jake leaned against her shoulder. "Do you think anyone ever comes here anymore?" he asked. "Not yet," she said, "but they will." When the stars appeared, faint through the haze, she turned the lantern off and listened. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed, soft, mournful, and far away. It made her heart ache with something she couldn't name. Before closing her eyes that night, Sarah made herself a quiet promise. She would fix this place no matter how long it took. She would make it stand again, make it mean something again. Not just for herself, but for Jake, who deserved a mother that didn't run from broken things. As she drifted toward sleep, the last thing she saw through the fogged window was the faint outline of the store against the night sky. The crooked roof, the peeling sign, the shadowed porch, all of it fragile and ruined, yet somehow waiting. In that fragile silence, Sarah realized she wasn't afraid anymore. The store, with all its decay and dust, was hers now. A wreck, yes, but also a beginning, a crossroads. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the exhaustion and fear, a small ember of hope began to glow. By morning, she would begin again. Morning came with a pale, hesitant light filtering through the holes in the roof. The air inside the old store was cold and smelled of mildew, wood rot, and dust that hadn't been disturbed in decades. Sarah woke up to the sound of crows outside, their calls echoing through the stillness like voices from another world. Jake was still asleep in the back seat of the car, his small body wrapped tightly in a blanket, his breath fogging the window. She stood for a moment, watching him, wondering how much longer she could keep pretending that everything would be fine. Then she turned toward the building that had somehow become her only plan for survival. The store looked even worse in the bright morning light. What had seemed like potential in the dusk now looked like a burden, a skeletal structure barely holding together. Paint peeled from the walls in long, curling strips. The porch sagged in the middle, its boards soft with rot. Broken glass glimmered across the entrance, and an entire section of the roof had caved in at the back. Yet beneath all that ruin, there was something undeniably solid about the frame, a stubbornness in the beams that refused to give up. Sarah felt a strange kinship with that. She too had been broken in places, patched together by necessity and stubborn will. She took off her jacket, rolled up her sleeves, and began working. The first day passed in silence, interrupted only by the scrape of a broom across the floor and the sound of boards creaking under her feet. She found old newspapers dating back to the 1960s, a few rusted tins, and an ancient broom leaning in the corner, its bristles worn to stubs. By noon, her hands were blistered, and her throat was raw from the dust. Jake, after finishing the remains of a cereal bar, joined in, dragging out boxes and broken shelves. Together, they filled trash bags with old debris, carrying them out to the side of the road where no one would likely collect them. By afternoon, Sarah discovered a rhythm in the work. Each broken shelf, each scraped floorboard, felt like a small victory. She hummed under her breath without realizing it. For the first time in years, she was doing something that mattered, something that might one day stand upright again. Every swing of the broom seemed to erase a fragment of her own failure. When Jake complained about the cold, she smiled and told him to keep moving. Work was the best way to stay warm. Later that day, as the sun tilted low over the horizon, a car slowed down in front of the store. The driver, a middle-aged man with a cap pulled low, leaned out the window. "You the one who bought that old place?" he called. Sarah nodded. The man gave a dry laugh. "You're wasting your time, lady. That store's been dead since before I was born. Best thing you could do is tear it down and sell the wood." Then he drove off, leaving behind a faint smell of gasoline and a cloud of dust. Sarah stood on the porch for a long moment, staring down the road after him. It wasn't anger she felt, but something colder, the deep loneliness of being the only person who still believed in something that everyone else had already buried. Inside, the store was quiet again, as if holding its breath. She lit a lantern, and the flickering light played over the cracked walls, casting shadows that almost looked like faces. She imagined the people who might have stood here once. Farmers buying supplies, children tugging at their mother's skirts, a shopkeeper counting coins behind the counter. All gone now, their laughter trapped somewhere in the dust. Over the next few days, Sarah worked from dawn until darkness. Jake grew more restless, but he tried to help. He swept the floors, carried planks, even chased out a raccoon that had made a nest behind the shelves. The nights were hardest, cold, damp, and silent except for the groan of wind pushing against the broken shutters. Sometimes she thought she heard footsteps upstairs, but when she climbed to check, the rooms were empty except for old furniture covered in gray sheets. On the fifth day, while clearing the back storage room, she found something unusual. Hidden behind a stack of rotted crates was an old metal cabinet, its door stuck shut. She pried it open with a screwdriver and found a thick ledger covered in dust. The leather was cracked, the pages yellowed, but the handwriting was neat and deliberate. The first entries were from 1954, lists of goods sold, names of customers, small debts and payments. But as she flipped toward the end, the tone changed. The entries became shorter, almost cryptic. Shipment placed in storage. Move to North Wall. Do not record. The last date was 1973. After that, the pages were blank. She frowned, tracing her fingers along the fading ink. What was this store really? Why would anyone hide shipments from the record? She turned the ledger over, looking for clues, but found only a faded stamp on the inside cover. Crossroads General Store, honest goods for honest people. The irony made her smile bitterly. That night, she brought the ledger to the car and showed it to Jake under the light of a flashlight. He stared at the neat loops of handwriting with the fascination of a child who saw mystery in everything. "Do you think it's like a secret code?" he asked. Sarah shrugged, though she felt a twinge of curiosity herself. "Maybe," she said, "or maybe people just liked hiding things." In truth, she couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time she walked across the store floor, she found herself glancing at the walls and floors differently, wondering what had once been hidden there. The words "North Wall" echoed in her mind. She tried knocking on the wood in that part of the room, but all she heard was a dull, solid thud. Still, the thought lingered, that somewhere in this wreck of a building, the past had left something behind. Her days soon fell into a routine. Mornings began with coffee heated on a camping stove, followed by hours of cleaning. She discovered that the front counter was made of oak beneath all the grime, and when she scrubbed away the years, the wood shone faintly again. Jake started carving small wooden signs from discarded boards, painting them with cheap watercolors. On one of them he wrote, "The Crossroads Market coming soon." Asham. He nailed it above the door, and though the paint dripped and the letters leaned crookedly, Sarah couldn't help smiling every time she saw it. The townspeople, few as they were, started to notice her persistence. The postman stopped by once a week and always shook his head, muttering something about city folk with too much hope. An elderly woman from the next street, Mrs. Leary, brought a loaf of bread one morning and said she remembered buying sugar in that very store as a girl. Her eyes filled with tears when she stepped inside and saw it half cleaned. "My daddy used to say," she murmured, "this was the heart of Elmridge. Every family passed through those doors at least once." Then she patted Sarah's arm and left without another word. That evening, Sarah sat on the porch watching the sky darken, the old ledger open in her lap. The town around her was quiet, a few lights flickering in distant windows. She wondered about the people who had once filled this street, who had believed in it enough to build homes and raise children here. Somewhere between her exhaustion and the steady hum of crickets, she realized something profound. She didn't just want to fix the store. She wanted to revive the town's forgotten heartbeat. Jake came out holding a small lantern. His hands were dirty, his hair full of sawdust. "Mom," he said softly, "do you think we can really make it work?" Sarah looked at him, his face lit by the warm glow of the lantern, his eyes full of cautious hope, and felt the weight of her promise pressing on her chest. "I think we have to," she said, "because if we can't make this work, then what's left?" That night, as they lay side by side in their sleeping bags on the floor of the store, Sarah listened to the wind moving through the broken boards and thought about the ledger again. The entries, the secrecy, the abrupt ending in 1973. They formed a question she couldn't ignore. Maybe there was something in this place worth finding, something that had been hidden for a reason, but for now she was too tired to chase mysteries. In the early hours before dawn, she woke suddenly. The moonlight poured through a gap in the roof, silvering the floorboards. For a moment she thought she heard soft footsteps again, light, hesitant, as if someone else was walking across the store. She sat up, holding her breath, but there was nothing. Only the sound of Jake's steady breathing and the faint rustle of wind through the trees. Still, the feeling stayed with her, a whisper of connection, as if the building itself was remembering something it wanted her to find. When morning came, the fog was thick over the fields. Sarah stood outside, her hands in her pockets, watching it drift around the old sign that still barely read, Crossroads General Store. The word Crossroads seemed to take on new meaning. It wasn't just the name of a store, it was a description of her life. She was standing at a place where past and future touched, where endings could become beginnings if one only had the courage to dig deep enough. She turned back toward the building and smiled faintly. Beneath all the decay, she thought she could feel something pulsing, the faint heartbeat of a place not ready to die. And as the fog began to lift, she made a quiet promise to herself. She would bring this place back to life. She would give it purpose again, even if it took everything she had left. What she didn't yet know was that beneath those worn floorboards, under layers of dust and history, The store still held a secret, one that would soon reach out from the past to change both her life and the fate of the town forever. The first rays of sunlight crept through the boarded windows, painting pale golden stripes across the dusty counter. Sarah awoke to the soft sound of her son moving quietly through the store. Jake had taken to rising early, as if the building itself whispered to him before dawn. He was crouched near the north wall again, tapping at the floorboards with the handle of a hammer. For days he had been obsessed with that section of the room, the one mentioned in the old ledger she had found. At first she thought it was just a boy's fascination with mystery, a harmless distraction from the exhausting labor of rebuilding. But now, as she watched him trace the seams between the planks with his small fingers, she felt a flicker of unease. "Mom," he said, his voice low but excited. "Listen to this." He tapped once more, and the sound came back different this time. Hollow, faintly resonant, unlike the solid thud of the boards around it. Sarah stood and crossed the room, kneeling beside him. She pressed her palm to the wood and felt a subtle vibration, like air moving beneath the surface. A hollow space. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Sarah took a screwdriver and began working the edges of the boards, prying one loose. It came up with a reluctant groan, releasing a puff of stale air that smelled of earth and rust. Beneath the plank was a dark cavity about 2 feet deep. Jake leaned closer, holding the flashlight, and the beam revealed something metallic. Sarah reached down and pulled up a small tin box, its hinges rusted shut. She set it on the counter, her hands trembling slightly. Jake's eyes widened with anticipation. It took several minutes to work the box open, but when the lid finally creaked free, a stack of envelopes appeared inside, tied together with a piece of frayed string. Each envelope bore a date, the earliest from 1947, the latest from 1973, the same year the ledger's entries had abruptly ended. Sarah untied the string and opened the top envelope. Inside was a folded piece of paper and a photograph of a man standing beside the very same counter where she now sat. The man's face was solemn, his eyes intense. The paper contained a letter written in graceful handwriting. "To whoever finds this, know that what we started here was never meant to disappear. The store was never just a business. It was a promise, a refuge for those who had nowhere else to go. If you are reading this, then time has finally caught up with our silence. Protect what is hidden, for it was never ours to profit from, only to guard until it was needed again." There was no signature, only a small symbol drawn beneath the words, a circle with a cross at its center like a compass rose. Sarah stared at it for a long time, her mind trying to make sense of the message. Refuge. Hidden. Guard until needed again. None of it fit with the image of a general store selling coffee and nails. Jake, meanwhile, was already sorting through the remaining envelopes. Some contained faded receipts, others small black and white photographs of people she didn't recognize. One photo showed a group of men and women standing outside the store, all dressed in work clothes, their faces half turned away from the camera. Behind them, painted faintly on the wall, she could make out the same compass symbol. "What does it mean?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Sarah admitted, "but your great-grandfather might have. Maybe this store was part of something bigger." For the rest of the morning, they went through every envelope, uncovering a pattern of letters and cryptic notes. There were references to shipments that didn't appear in the ledger. Winter goods for passage, safe arrival confirmed, new contacts through the Valley Road. None of it made sense to her at first. The handwriting changed between some letters, suggesting that more than one person had been involved in writing them. It read less like business correspondence and more like the coded communication of people who couldn't speak openly. By afternoon, Sarah sat at the counter surrounded by papers. Her coffee had gone cold hours ago. Jake had wandered outside to explore the yard behind the store, leaving her alone with the faint ticking of an old clock that hadn't worked in years. She turned the photograph of the solemn man over again. There was something about his expression, the seriousness in his eyes, that stirred a strange reverence in her. She tried to imagine what kind of refuge he meant. The sound of Jake's voice calling her name snapped her back to the present. She rushed outside to find him standing near the collapsed shed at the back of the property, holding something in his hands. It was a brass key, green with age, attached to a small wooden tag carved with the same compass symbol. Beneath it, faintly etched, were the letters NW. "It was buried under that old crate," Jake said breathlessly. "It matches the symbol in the letters, doesn't it?" Sarah took the key, turning it over in her fingers. The weight of it felt significant. Not just metal, but history. She glanced at the tag again. NW. North wall, the same section they had just opened. She hurried back inside, searching the wall from floor to ceiling. Near the baseboard, behind a section of warped paneling, she noticed a faint outline, a rectangular seam that didn't belong. She pressed her fingers along it and felt a slight give. The panel shifted under pressure. Her heart began to race. Using the screwdriver again, she pried the section of paneling loose. Behind it was a narrow cavity and, at its center, an old padlock. She inserted the key, turned it, and heard a satisfying click. The wooden frame swung open to reveal a small compartment lined with tin sheeting. Inside was a leather-bound notebook, larger than the ledger, but written in the same precise handwriting. The first page bore a title, Records of the Crossroads Network. Sarah sat down slowly, her pulse pounding. The word network sent a chill through her. She flipped through the pages, and the further she read, the more her disbelief grew. The notebook wasn't a business record at all. It was an account of people who had passed through the store seeking shelter. Names, dates, and destinations filled the pages. Each entry described a traveler, often with brief notes like, fled from Chicago, safe passage arranged to St. Louis. Or, family of 3, avoid police patrol near rail line. Some entries mentioned hidden routes, safe houses, and contacts identified only by initials. She recognized one pattern immediately. Every page ended with the same symbol, the compass, followed by the words, trust maintained. It took her hours to process what she was reading. The Crossroads store had been more than a local market. During a time of unrest, maybe during the civil rights era, or some later crisis, it had served as a secret waypoint for people escaping danger, a quiet sanctuary disguised as an ordinary shop. Her grandfather, or perhaps someone before him, had been part of a hidden humanitarian network that had continued long after the world believed such efforts had ended. When Jake returned, she didn't try to hide her excitement. She showed him the notebook, explaining what little she understood. "People came here when they needed to disappear," she said softly. "They found safety under this roof." Jake's eyes shone with a mix of awe and confusion. "So, Grandpa helped them?" "It looks that way," she said. "And maybe that's why he wrote about protecting what's hidden." That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. The discovery had filled her with energy she hadn't felt in years. She sat by the lantern, rereading the notebook, trying to trace the names. Some were common, others foreign, a few marked only by initials. Near the end of the book, she found a line written in trembling handwriting. "The last traveler has gone. The roads are no longer safe. But one day, someone will need this place again. Leave the key and trust." Those words hit her harder than she expected. It was as if the writer had reached across decades to speak directly to her. The thought made her shiver, because hadn't she, too, come here in desperation, seeking shelter when the world had turned against her? She wasn't escaping political persecution, but she knew what it meant to lose everything, to have nowhere left to go. When dawn broke, she stepped outside to breathe the cool morning air. The world felt strangely alive, the air sharper, the birds louder. The store behind her didn't seem quite so broken anymore. Its sagging porch and faded walls had become symbols of endurance rather than decay. She turned to see Jake sitting on the steps, sketching the compass symbol in his notebook. "Do you think it's still important?" he asked without looking up. "The network thing?" Sarah hesitated before answering. "I think anything built to help people is always important," she said, "even if the world forgets about it for a while." Over the next several days, she and Jake worked with renewed purpose. The store's restoration no longer felt like an act of survival, but a continuation of something sacred. She cleaned the shelves more carefully, polished the counters until they glowed faintly, and patched the broken roof with whatever materials she could salvage. The physical work felt different now, meaningful, almost ceremonial. Word began to spread again through the town. A few curious neighbors stopped by to see what progress she'd made. When they asked why she was bothering with such a hopeless place, she smiled and said only that every building had a story worth saving. None of them pressed her further, but she could tell that whispers were spreading. The divorced woman from the city, the sun poking around in ruins, the strange lights burning late into the night. One afternoon, while painting the porch railing, Sarah heard footsteps on the gravel drive. She turned to see an older man in a gray suit approaching. He introduced himself as Mr. Garvey, a local historian who'd heard from Mrs. Leary that she'd uncovered old documents. His tone was polite, but his eyes were sharp, assessing. "I've been studying the old transport routes in this county," he said. "That store of yours sits right on what used to be the North Road to the river, a route that played a role in several discrete operations." Sarah's heart skipped. "What kind of operations?" Garvey smiled thinly. "The kind that don't show up in official records. You'd be surprised how many small-town shops and churches played a part in moving people quietly across state lines." He asked if he could see the ledger, but Sarah hesitated. Something about his eagerness unsettled her. She told him she'd have to review what she had before sharing it, and he nodded with an understanding that felt rehearsed. As he left, he handed her his card. "History has a way of resurfacing at the most inconvenient times," he said. "Be careful what you dig up." That night, she couldn't stop thinking about his words. When she checked the spot where the notebook was hidden, she noticed that the lock had been disturbed. Nothing was missing, but the dust patterns were different. Someone had been inside. Her unease deepened into something closer to fear. Jake, sensing her tension, asked if everything was all right. She forced a smile. "Just tired," she said. But when she lay down that night, she left the lantern burning low and the key to the compartment under her pillow. Sleep came fitfully, haunted by the thought of footsteps in the hall and whispers beneath the floorboards. Yet beneath her fear was something else, a sense of destiny, of being drawn into a story that had begun long before she was born. She didn't yet know that the secret she had uncovered would soon place her and Jake in real danger, or that the store's legacy would demand far more from her than she ever imagined. By the time the sun rose again, she had made a decision. Whatever this place was, whatever history it carried, she would protect it, just as the letters had instructed. The Crossroads store had waited half a century for someone to keep its promise alive. Now it was her turn. The wind began to change 2 days after Sarah's discovery of the notebook. It came rolling through the valley with a strange, heavy scent, carrying the promise of rain and something darker, the kind of unease that settles in your bones before a storm breaks. The days had grown colder, the sky a flat gray, and the sound of the wind around the eaves of the store had taken on an almost human quality, like distant voices murmuring secrets through the cracks in the old wood. Sarah had always been good at ignoring fear, but lately it seemed the building itself was trying to tell her that she was no longer alone in what she'd found. She didn't mention the disturbance with the lock to Jake. He was too young to carry that kind of worry, and besides, she still half believed she might have imagined it. But that belief was harder to maintain when she found footprints in the mud near the back entrance one morning, large, heavy, and fresh. They weren't hers, and they certainly weren't Jake's. The shape of the prints suggested work boots, the kind worn by construction men or laborers. But there was something deliberate about them, like whoever had left them wanted to be seen. That same morning, the postman brought a small envelope addressed to the owner of the Crossroads property. The handwriting was unfamiliar, slanted and careful. Inside was a single sheet of paper bearing a short typed message. "You've inherited more than you understand. Sell while you still can." There was no signature, no return address. Sarah stood for a long moment on the porch, reading the words over and over. The air was still, and for the first time since she'd bought the property, she felt the weight of genuine fear settle in her chest. She burned the letter that evening in the metal trash barrel behind the store, watching the flames curl the paper into ash. Jake came out to stand beside her, holding a blanket around his shoulders. "You okay, Mom?" he asked. She forced a small smile. "Just cold," she said, though the chill she felt had nothing to do with the weather. That night, rain began to fall, slow at first, then in heavy sheets that pounded the tin roof and leaked through the cracks she hadn't yet managed to seal. They placed buckets around the room, but soon gave up and huddled together near the old stove. The fire flickered low, its light turning the shadows long and restless. Outside, the storm howled like a living thing, tearing at the edges of the world. It was past midnight when the knock came, a single heavy thud that echoed through the store like a hammer strike. Sarah froze, her hand still on the mug she'd been holding. Jake looked up, wide-eyed. "Who is that?" he whispered. She didn't answer. Another knock followed, slower this time. Deliberate. Whoever it was didn't seem afraid of the storm. She picked up the flashlight and moved toward the front door. The rain was so loud she could barely hear her own heartbeat. "Who's there?" she called, her voice steadier than she felt. There was a pause, then a deep voice answered from the other side, muffled by the rain. "Name's Richard Hale. My car broke down up the road. I saw your light." Sarah hesitated. The man sounded calm, not desperate, but something about the way he spoke, measured, too composed, made her uneasy. Still, it was raining hard enough to drown a man, and she couldn't bring herself to turn him away. She unlatched the door and opened it just enough to see a tall figure standing under the porch light. He was in his late 40s, with dark hair graying at the temples and a long coat soaked through from the rain. His eyes, sharp and pale, flicked around the room before settling on her. "I hate to impose," he said, his tone polite but distant, "but I've been walking nearly an hour. Thought I'd freeze to death if I didn't find shelter." Sarah nodded slowly. "Come in." He stepped inside, shaking the rain from his coat. Water pooled around his boots. "You picked a bad night to get stranded," she said, forcing a bit of casualness into her tone. He smiled faintly. "Seems to be my luck lately." Jake appeared from behind the counter, studying the stranger with a mix of curiosity and caution. The man offered him a nod, then turned back to Sarah. "This place yours?" "Bought it a few weeks ago," she said, trying to fix it up. His eyes swept the room. The half-clean shelves, the patched ceiling, the faint smell of old dust and wood smoke. "A brave project," he said finally. Not many would bother. Sarah poured him a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove. He accepted it with a quiet thank you and sat near the fire. For a while, the only sounds were the wind outside and the ticking of rain on the tin roof. She studied him in the firelight. His coat was worn but expensive, his hands calloused but steady. He didn't look like a lost traveler, more like someone who'd come with a purpose. "So," she said carefully, "where were you headed?" He took a sip of coffee before answering. "Just passing through. I used to live around here, long time ago. Thought I'd see what was left." Sarah's stomach tightened. "This town?" He nodded. "Milford. My father had business here back in the day. Your store. Used to be something of a landmark." She tried to sound casual. "You remember it?" "Oh, yes," he said. "I remember it well. This was more than a store once. It was where people came when they didn't have anywhere else to go." He glanced up at her, his gaze sharp and knowing. "Funny how history repeats itself, isn't it?" The way he said it sent a chill down her spine. She forced a small laugh. "Maybe," she said, "but history doesn't pay the bills." He smiled at that, but didn't reply. Instead, he set his empty cup down and stood, wandering slowly toward the north wall, the one that hid the secret compartment. Sarah's pulse quickened as she watched him trace his hand along the wood, almost absently, as if confirming something he already knew. "You've been doing some digging," he said quietly. Sarah's throat went dry. "Just cleaning up." He murmured as if unconvinced. Cleaning tends to uncover things best left buried. She didn't like his tone. "If you're here to warn me off, you can save your breath. Whatever stories people tell about this place, I'm not selling." He turned to face her then, and for a moment his expression softened, almost sympathetic. "I'm not a buyer, Mrs. Turner. I'm just someone who understands what happens to people who find things they shouldn't." Before she could respond, a loud crack of thunder shook the windows. Jake flinched, and the lantern on the counter flickered. When the light steadied again, the man's gaze had softened. "I didn't mean to frighten you," he said, his voice low. "It's just, not everyone who asks about this place has good intentions." Sarah crossed her arms. And what about you? He didn't answer right away. Let's just say I used to know someone who worked here. Someone who believed this building was special. When they died, certain people took an interest in their affairs. You'd do well to be careful who you trust. He pulled a small card from his coat pocket and placed it on the counter. It bore only a name, Richard Hale, historical consultant, and a phone number. If you find something that doesn't make sense, call me, he said. You might not get another chance. Then, without waiting for a response, he picked up his coat and stepped out into the rain. She watched from the doorway as he walked down the road, the darkness swallowing him until he vanished into the storm. For a long time after he left, she stood there, the card in her hand, the rain drumming hard enough to drown out her thoughts. When she finally turned back inside, she found Jake sitting cross-legged by the fire, his face pale. "Who was he?" he asked. "I don't know," she said softly. "But I think he knew more about this place than he let on." That night, sleep refused to come. Every gust of wind against the windows sounded like footsteps. Every creak of the floorboards felt like someone moving in the dark. She kept seeing the stranger's eyes, calm and cold, as he spoke about people who shouldn't find certain things. In the morning, the storm had passed, leaving the town washed clean and glistening under a hard blue sky. The road was littered with branches and debris. Sarah went outside to check the property, but what she found made her heart lurch. The padlock on the back door had been cut clean through. Inside, nothing appeared stolen, but the compartment behind the north wall stood open, the notebook lying exposed. She ran her hand over the cover. It was still there, but the last few pages had been turned, as though someone had rifled through them in a hurry. On the counter beside the book lay something new, a folded note written on plain white paper. "You're not the only one looking for the past. Some histories don't want to be remembered." The handwriting wasn't Hale's. It was smaller, more deliberate. She stared at the message until her hands began to shake. Whoever had left it hadn't taken anything. They'd only wanted her to know they'd been there. For the rest of the day, she felt like she was moving through a dream. Every sound seemed too loud, every shadow too long. When she told Jake to stay inside, he didn't argue. She locked the doors, boarded the back window, and made sure the notebook and key were hidden again, this time beneath a loose floorboard in the bedroom upstairs. That evening, as the sun dipped low, she saw movement at the edge of the woods, a flicker of light, like a flashlight beam sweeping once across the trees. When she stepped onto the porch, it vanished. She waited until the darkness deepened, but whoever was out there never came closer. Sleep eluded her again. She sat by the window watching the road, thinking about the man who had called himself Richard Hale. His warning echoed in her mind. Not everyone who asks about this place has good intentions. She thought of the letters, the compass symbol, the people who had once sought refuge here. Maybe what they'd hidden wasn't just their names or possessions. Maybe it was something people would still kill to find. By dawn, her decision was made. She couldn't keep running from fear. If there were answers buried in this store, she would find them before anyone else did. Whatever the Crossroads network had been, whatever it had protected, she was part of it now, whether she wanted to be or not. Outside, the world was silent again. The air smelled of wet earth and new beginnings. Somewhere beyond the fields, she thought she heard the low hum of an engine starting. Distant, deliberate, like someone who'd been waiting for her to wake. The morning after the storm brought an uneasy calm, as though the town itself were holding its breath. The sky had cleared to a pale, fragile blue, but the air still smelled of rain and iron. Sarah stood on the porch of the Crossroads store, watching mist rise from the wet road. Somewhere far off, a dog barked once and fell silent. The night's fear still clung to her, but beneath it pulsed something steadier, deeper, a kind of resolve that had not existed in her before. She was done being afraid. Whatever truth the store held, whatever danger lingered around its history, she would face it head on. The building had survived a century of storms. So would she. Jake joined her a few minutes later, still rubbing the sleep from his eyes. His hair was messy, his face pale. He carried his sketchbook under his arm. "I had a dream again," he said. "The one with the light." She looked at him, frowning slightly. "What light?" "In the floor," he answered, opening the notebook. Inside was a pencil drawing of the store's main room. The counter, the shelves, the north wall. But in the center of the floor, he had drawn a bright circle surrounded by marks that looked like rays. "I saw it shining through the wood," he said, "like something buried underneath." Sarah hesitated. She wanted to dismiss it as a child's imagination, but after everything they had uncovered, she couldn't. "Show me where," she said quietly. Inside, the store was dim and cold. The light through the windows fell in long stripes across the dusty floor. Jake pointed to a spot near the old counter, right in front of the register. "Here, man," he said. Sarah knelt, pressing her ear to the floorboards. At first, she heard only the faint creak of wood and the ticking of her own heartbeat. But when she tapped the spot with her knuckles, the sound came back hollow. Her pulse quickened. They had already found one hidden space beneath the boards. Was it possible there was another? She fetched a screwdriver and began prying at the seams. The first board came up easily. Beneath it was a layer of packed earth, darker than the surrounding ground, and something metallic glinted faintly in the light. Jake crouched beside her, holding the flashlight. "What is it?" he whispered. Sarah brushed away the dirt with her fingers until she felt the cool edge of a metal hinge. She cleared more soil, revealing the outline of a small trapdoor, its frame reinforced with rusted iron. Her heart began to race. "Help me lift it," she said. Together they heaved the door open. A puff of cold, stale air rose from the darkness below. A narrow wooden staircase descended into shadow. The smell that drifted up was one of earth, oil, and time. Sarah took the flashlight and aimed it downward. The beam caught the faint outline of shelves, wooden crates, and something else-shaped draped in heavy cloth. For a long moment, she hesitated. The memory of the warning notes and the stranger's cold eyes flickered through her mind. But then she looked at Jake. His face glowed with the same fearless curiosity that once drove her to buy this place when the world thought she was a fool. She took his hand. "Stay close," she said, and started down. The steps groaned under their weight but held. The basement was larger than she expected, its ceiling supported by thick beams darkened with age. The flashlight swept over shelves lined with jars, boxes, and tools covered in decades of dust. In the corner stood a desk and an old oil lamp. On the wall above it hung the same compass symbol she had seen in the notebook, carved directly into the wood. Beneath the carving, someone had painted words so faded they were almost invisible. "For those who come after." Sarah's throat tightened. She stepped closer, brushing the dust from the desk. A small key sat on top of it, newer than the rest of the room, shining faintly in the light. Jake reached for it. "Careful," she said, but he had already picked it up. There was a number etched into its surface, 47. On the floor beside the desk stood a locked metal chest. Sarah's hands trembled as she tried the key. It turned easily, and the lock snapped open with a clean click. Inside lay another bundle of documents, tied neatly with string, and something wrapped in cloth. She lifted the papers first. They were written in the same hand as the notebook records, lists of names and dates, maps of routes across the state. But these were newer, some from the 1980s, even the early 2000s. The network hadn't died when the letters stopped. It had continued quietly, adapting, surviving. Underneath the papers was the wrapped object. She unfolded the cloth carefully and found a small brass plaque. The engraving read, "The Crossroads Fund, established 1934, for the rebuilding of the community and the sheltering of the lost." Beneath it, in smaller letters, "Guarded in trust until needed again." Sarah sat back on her heels, overcome. The ledger, the notebook, the hidden compartments, it all came together now. The store hadn't just been a sanctuary, it had been the center of a movement, a quiet engine that kept hope alive through decades of hardship. The money hidden long ago had been meant to help others, to restore what had been broken. The people who had built this network had understood something fundamental, that generosity must sometimes hide to survive. Jake's voice broke through her thoughts. "Mom," he said softly, "there's something else." He was pointing to a shelf against the far wall. On it sat a box smaller than the rest, carved from dark wood and sealed with wax. The compass symbol was pressed into the top. She lifted it carefully and set it on the desk. The wax crumbled under her touch, and inside she found several old envelopes and a folded letter addressed simply to the keeper. Her hands shook as she opened it. If you are reading this, then the Crossroads has chosen you. This place does not belong to any one person. It belongs to those who refuse to give up on others. The fund, the records, the stories, they were never meant to bring wealth. They were meant to remind us that goodness, once buried, can still take root again. Do not sell this place. Do not let it become another forgotten ruin. Use what is here to help the living, as those before you helped the lost. There was no signature, but at the bottom of the page was a single fingerprint pressed in faded ink. Sarah folded the letter slowly, her chest tightening. She looked around the room, the old tools, the maps, the evidence of decades of hidden kindness, and felt tears well in her eyes. All this time, she had been trying to rebuild the store for survival, for her and Jake. But the truth was bigger than that. The store had never been about profit or reputation. It had always been about faith. When they climbed back up into the daylight, the air felt different. The sun had fully risen, casting long shadows across the porch. Sarah took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. She turned to Jake, who still clutched the brass plaque in his hands. "Do you know what this means?" she asked. He nodded, his eyes wide. "We have to keep it safe," he said, like they did. In the following days, the news spread through town faster than she expected. It started when she brought the documents to the mayor's office, not to surrender them, but to share the story. At first, no one believed her. The idea that their dying town had once been part of something noble and secret sounded like fantasy. But when she showed them the letters, the maps, the seal of the Crossroads Fund, disbelief turned into quiet awe. The local paper published an article, "Single Mother Revives Hidden Legacy of Elmridge." Soon people began to come, first out of curiosity, then out of pride. Neighbors who had ignored her before arrived with paint, tools, and food. The carpenter who had once mocked her offered to repair the roof. The librarian volunteered to catalog the documents. Even the postman stopped shaking his head and started delivering supplies instead of warnings. Bit by bit, the Crossroads store came back to life. Sarah reopened it not as a business, but as a community space. The shelves filled with books, crafts, and homemade goods from local families. A small notice board appeared near the counter where people could leave messages offering help or asking for it. Every Friday evening, neighbors gathered to share food and music. Jake helped paint the new sign that hung above the door. It read, "Crossroads Market, Hope Returns Here." One afternoon, as she stood outside watching the townspeople rebuild what had once been lost, Sarah felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. The store was no longer silent. The laughter of children echoed where dust and shadows had ruled. The smell of fresh bread mixed with the faint scent of rain. It wasn't perfect, but it was alive. A few weeks later, she received a letter in the mail. The envelope was unmarked, the handwriting unfamiliar. Inside was a single sentence. "The network remembers." Beneath it was the compass symbol. She stared at it for a long time, then folded it carefully and placed it inside the ledger. She didn't know who had sent it, whether it was Richard Hale or someone else. But it didn't matter. The message was clear. The work wasn't finished. It never would be. Months passed, and the seasons turned. The Crossroads Market became the heart of Elmridge once again. Farmers brought their goods, children sold lemonade, and travelers stopped by to rest. Sarah often caught herself watching the door, half expecting to see the man with the gray eyes return, but he never did. Instead, she sometimes found small tokens left on the counter. A folded note, a coin, a drawing of the compass symbol left by people she didn't recognize. The legacy of the store had awakened something in others, something larger than any one person's story. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, Sarah stood by the porch steps with Jake. The golden light washed over the town, painting everything in soft amber. She looked at her son, who was taller now, his eyes bright and confident. "Do you remember when we first came here?" she asked. He nodded. "You said it smelled like the past," he said. "But now it smells like bread and paint." She laughed softly. "It smells like life." They stood together in silence, watching the lights of the town flicker on, one by one. Somewhere down the street, a guitar began to play, and laughter drifted through the evening air. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the warmth of it all, the noise, the hope, the steady heartbeat of a place that refused to die. Inside, on the wall above the counter, hung the brass plaque they had found in the basement. Every day she passed beneath it and touched it for luck. The words engraved on it had become her prayer, her promise, for the rebuilding of the community and the sheltering of the lost. Sometimes late at night, when the store was quiet again and Jake was asleep, she would sit alone by the window and think about the long line of people who had kept this place alive through the years. She imagined their faces, their hands, their courage. She thought about how, even in their silence, they had believed that the world could be mended if someone just cared enough to try. Now she was part of that chain one link in a legacy that had outlived fear, poverty, and time. And as she looked out over the town that had once turned its back on hope but now glowed softly in the dark, she smiled and whispered into the stillness, "We found the treasure after all." It wasn't gold or silver, and it wasn't hidden beneath the floorboards anymore. It was here in the laughter outside, in the warmth of the fire, in the faces of people who had remembered how to believe again. The Crossroads store had kept its promise, and so had she. If this story moved you, don't leave just yet. Hit subscribe and turn on the bell so you won't miss what's coming next. Watch another story right now and share this video with someone who still believes in second chances.